The morning room at Ashworth House caught the pale light of early spring in 1815 with a gentleness that seemed to mock the anxiety settling in Clara's chest as she poured tea for her mother, the delicate china trembling only slightly in her practiced hands. At 28 years of age, Clara Ashworth had grown accustomed to the weight of her unmarried state, to the way conversations quieted when she entered drawing rooms, to the pitying glances from matrons whose daughters had long since secured advantageous matches. The morning room itself reflected their circumstances with painful honesty, comfortable but modest. The wallpaper faded where sunlight had touched it year after year, the furniture well-maintained but unfashionable. Relics from happier days before her father's death had left them with more debts than income. Mrs. Ashworth accepted her teacup with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, those eyes that lately seemed to linger on Clara with increasing concern, as though her daughter were a puzzle whose solution grew more urgent with each passing season. Clara settled into her chair by the window, where spring flowers were just beginning to push through the earth in the small garden, their determined bloom a reminder that some things persisted despite unfavorable conditions. She had made her peace with spinsterhood, or so she told herself in the quiet hours when loneliness pressed too heavily against her ribs. There were consolations in her life, books and music, the companionship of her mother, the freedom from the demands of managing a household for an indifferent husband. Yet somewhere beneath the practiced resignation lived a stubborn ember of longing, carefully banked but never quite extinguished, the foolish hope that perhaps something might yet bloom for her as surely as those flowers sought the light. The knock at the door startled them both, and Clara watched as their housekeeper entered, bearing a cream-colored envelope on a silver tray that had somehow survived the creditors. Lady Pembroke's seal gleamed in the morning light, and Mrs. Ashworth's hands fluttered with sudden excitement as she broke the wax. "An invitation," she announced, her voice rising with an enthusiasm Clara had not heard in months. A masked ball at Pembroke House in 3 days' time, a grand affair to celebrate the peace and the return of England's soldiers from the continent. Clara felt the familiar sinking in her stomach that accompanied such invitations, the prospect of standing at the periphery of glittering society, watching younger women dance while she smiled and pretended contentment with her wallflower existence. But her mother's face held such hope, such gentle pleading, that Clara found herself unable to voice the refusal forming on her lips. Perhaps the mask might offer some small mercy, some brief anonymity in which she might move through the evening without the weight of pitying stares. The following days unfolded in a flurry of preparation that transformed the quiet monotony of Ashworth House into something approaching festivity, and Clara found herself swept along by her mother's determined enthusiasm despite the familiar weight of doubt that pressed against her chest. Mrs. Ashworth approached the masked ball with a hopefulness that Clara recognized as both touching and painful, treating the invitation as though it were a door opening onto possibility rather than another evening of quiet humiliation dressed in silk. They spent the afternoon sorting through Clara's limited wardrobe, her mother's practiced fingers assessing each gown with a critical eye that sought to conjure elegance from modest means. The blue silk finally chosen had been Clara's best dress for 3 seasons now, its color deepened to sapphire in certain lights, the fabric still fine despite careful maintenance and minor alterations to accommodate changing fashions. Her mother insisted on fresh ivory ribbons threaded through the bodice, a small extravagance that made Clara's throat tighten with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. The mask itself arrived from the village seamstress on the morning of the ball, delicate silver filigree that would cover the upper half of Clara's face, transforming her into someone mysterious and unknown. Mrs. Ashworth held it up to the light streaming through the drawing-room window, her expression soft, with an emotion Clara could not quite name. "Perhaps the mask will allow you to forget yourself for an evening," her mother said quietly. And Clara understood the unspoken completion of that thought. Forget what you believe yourself to be, and remember what you might have been. Clara took the mask in her hands, feeling the slight weight of it, the cool metal that would rest against her skin and hide the unremarkable features she had long since accepted as her inheritance. There was something liberating in the thought of anonymity, of moving through Lady Pembroke's grand rooms without the immediate recognition that typically preceded pitying glances or studied indifference. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the hour of departure approached, Clara felt her practical expectations warring with something more dangerous, that foolish ember of hope stirring despite her best efforts to smother it. She dressed with unusual care, allowing her mother to arrange her dark hair in a softer style than her typical severe knot, small curls framing her face in a way that felt almost frivolous. The carriage ride to Pembroke House seemed both too long and too short, the countryside passing in twilight blue as Clara's stomach twisted with anticipation and dread. When the great house finally came into view, its windows blazing with candlelight against the deepening dusk, Clara felt her breath catch at the beauty of it, this world of elegance and ease into which she would step as temporary visitor, masked and unrecognized, free for one evening to inhabit the edges of a life that would never truly be hers. The grand entrance hall of Pembroke House opened before Clara like a passage into another world, all marble and gilt and blazing crystal chandeliers that threw dancing light across walls hung with silk damask in deep crimson, and she felt her breath catch, despite her determination to remain unmoved by such displays of wealth and consequence. A liveried footman took her cloak with practiced efficiency, and then she was moving forward with the other masked guests toward the ballroom, her silver filigree mask settling against her face like a second skin that promised anonymity even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The ballroom itself stole whatever composure she had managed to gather, a cavernous space lit by hundreds of candles in sconces along walls painted with pastoral scenes, the ceiling arching high above in cream and gold, the polished floor reflecting the swirl of dancers who moved through a waltz with practiced grace. Music poured from an orchestra positioned in an alcove draped with hothouse flowers, violins weaving through the conversation and laughter that rose from clusters of guests, all masked, all glittering in silks and jewels that caught the light with every movement. Clara found herself pressed to the side by the flow of arrivals, and she let the current carry her to the periphery where she had always belonged, her blue silk gown suddenly seeming shabby despite the fresh ribbons, her mask feeling less like liberation and more like a flimsy shield against the casual cruelty of this world. She recognized voices even behind their disguises, Lady Pembroke holding court near the refreshment tables, young Harriet Montague's distinctive laugh floating above the music as she captured the attention of a tall gentleman in a black domino, mothers positioning their daughters with strategic precision in the paths of eligible gentlemen. The masks changed nothing essential, Clara realized with a sinking heart, merely decorated the same tired performance with a veneer of mystery that would dissolve the moment midnight came and everyone revealed themselves. She watched a young woman in pink silk glide past on the arm of her partner, their steps perfectly matched, and felt the familiar ache of exclusion settle into her bones. Here was beauty and youth and all the currency that mattered in this glittering market, and she was merely an observer pressed against the wall, too old and plain to merit even a pitying glance. The heat of so many bodies in motion made the air thick despite the height of the ceiling, and Clara felt her breath growing shallow beneath the mask. She needed air, needed escape from this reminder of everything she was not, and could never be. The terrace doors stood open along the far wall, curtains billowing slightly in the night breeze that promised coolness and solitude, and Clara began to edge along the periphery toward them, her decision forming with each step to slip into the garden where she might breathe freely and gather herself before enduring the rest of this evening. The garden air embraced Clara the moment she stepped through the terrace doors, cool and green and alive with the scent of early roses and night-blooming jasmine that grew thick along the stone balustrade separating manicured lawn from darker wilderness beyond. She moved quickly away from the spill of light and music, her slippers whispering against flagstone as she descended shallow steps into the moonlit expanse where gravel paths wound between sculptured hedges and marble statuary gleamed pale as ghosts in the darkness. The relief of solitude washed over her like water, and she felt her shoulders drop from their defensive posture as the sounds of the ballroom faded to a distant hum beneath the closer symphony of cricket song and rustling leaves stirred by the spring breeze. She followed a path toward what appeared to be a fountain, the musical splash of water drawing her deeper into the garden's embrace, and when she reached the circular basin with its central statue of some classical goddess pouring water from an urn, Clara stopped and allowed herself to simply breathe. The moon hung full and luminous overhead, silver light transforming the ordinary world into something enchanted, and Clara lifted trembling fingers to her mask, loosening the ribbons that held it in place and drawing it away from her face with a sigh of relief. The night air felt glorious against her heated skin, and she closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the fountain and the distant music, and trying to quiet the longing that the evening had stirred despite all her careful defenses. She had not heard the approach of footsteps on grass, had not sensed another presence until a masculine voice spoke from the shadows near the hedge, low and slightly rough, with something that might have been weariness or amusement. "Forgive me, I did not mean to intrude on your solitude," the voice said, and Clara's eyes flew open as a tall figure emerged from the darkness into the moonlight. A gentleman without his mask, his features half illuminated and half shadowed, in a way that made it impossible to discern details beyond the impression of strong bones and dark hair, and an expression that seemed as weary as her own. Clara's hand flew to her bare face, her mask dangling forgotten from her other hand as panic and embarrassment flooded through her, but the gentleman raised one hand in a gesture of peace. "Please, do not flee," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of genuine entreaty. "I too sought escape from the performance within, and I have no interest in unmasking mysteries or carrying tales back to the ballroom." Clara found herself frozen in place, her heart hammering but her feet refusing to obey the impulse to run, and in the charged silence that stretched between them, she saw him smile slightly, a curve of lips that held more resignation than happiness. "It seems we are both refugees from society's demands," he continued, moving no closer but settling himself onto the edge of the fountain as though to demonstrate he posed no threat. "Shall we declare this garden neutral territory where the rules of that glittering prison need not apply?" Clara found herself nodding before caution could reassert its hold, and she moved closer to the fountain, settling onto the stone edge at a careful distance from the gentleman whose features remained tantalizingly obscured in the shifting moonlight and shadow. "There is something liberating about the darkness," she heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice when her heart still hammered against her ribs. "We might be anyone here, unburdened by the weight of what the world expects us to be." The gentleman made a sound that might have been agreement or something deeper, and he turned his face toward the fountain where the water caught moonlight and threw it back in glittering fragments. "I have spent 4 years on the continent," he said quietly, and the weight in his voice spoke of more than simple travel. "When I returned, I found society's games more exhausting than the campaigns I left behind. All this endless performance of caring about things that matter not at all, while the truly important questions go unasked and unanswered." Clara felt something shift in her chest at the honesty in his words, a recognition that called to her own weariness with surfaces and pretense. "The war," she said softly, and saw him nod in the darkness. "You were a soldier." "I was many things," he replied, "and none of them prepared me for the peculiar battle of ballrooms and drawing rooms where the weapons are gossip and the casualties are those who fail to meet arbitrary standards of worth." Clara found herself speaking before thought could censor impulse, her voice carrying an edge of bitterness she had not known she possessed until this moment of anonymous freedom gave it permission to emerge. And what of those who were never deemed worthy of entry to the battle in the first place? She asked. Those whom society has already judged and found wanting by measures that have nothing to do with character or heart or mind. The gentleman turned toward her fully then, and even in shadow she could see the intensity of his regard, a focusing of attention that made her breath catch. "Tell me," he said, and it was not a polite request, but something hungry and real. "Tell me what arbitrary measures have been used to dismiss you, for I cannot imagine any rational standard that would find you wanting when you speak with such clarity and passion." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, and was grateful for the darkness that concealed her blush. "You know nothing of me," she protested, but he shook his head. "I know that you sought escape from that glittering prison as I did," he countered. "I know that you speak of literature and ideas rather than weather and gossip. For when I asked about books, you did not pretend ignorance to flatter my supposed superior knowledge, but instead offered genuine thoughts about Byron and Scott and the romantic poets who are currently scandalizing proper drawing rooms. I know that you possess both intelligence and feeling, which makes you rare and precious in a world that values neither." Clara found her throat tight with emotion she could not name, this strange blend of longing and fear and something dangerously close to hope. The music changed in the ballroom behind them, the lively country dance giving way to the slower, more intimate strains of a waltz, and Clara watched as the gentleman tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something more than the melody that drifted through the garden air on currents of breeze that carried with it the mingled scents of jasmine and roses and beeswax candles. He rose from the fountain's edge with a fluid grace that spoke of strength carefully controlled, and he turned toward her with his hand extended in a gesture that was both invitation and question. The moonlight caught the pale fabric of his evening gloves as he held his palm open between them. "Dance with me," he said quietly, and it was not a command but an entreaty that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Here beneath the stars where there is no one to judge our steps or count the measures of our worth by the prominence of our partners." Clara felt her heart hammering so violently she was certain he must hear it in the quiet garden, punctuated only by fountain splash and distant music, and every sensible thought screamed that she should refuse, should gather her mask and her dignity, and flee back to the safety of the ballroom's periphery where she belonged. But the moonlight made everything strange and possible, and the warmth in his voice called to something in her that had been silent so long she had forgotten it existed. And before caution could reassert its hold, Clara found her hand rising to meet his, her fingers trembling as they settled into his palm, and felt the warmth of him even through the barrier of glove and glove. He drew her closer with infinite care, his other hand coming to rest at her waist with a touch so light she barely felt it. And then they were moving together to the distant waltz as moonlight silvered the world around them and turned the ordinary garden into something from a fairy story where magic still lived and impossible things might yet come true. Clara had waltzed before in the safety of her mother's drawing room with only furniture as partners, practicing steps she had never expected to use, but nothing in those solitary rehearsals had prepared her for the reality of moving in harmony with another person, feeling the subtle guidance of his hand at her waist and the strength in his frame as he led her through the figures with an easy confidence that made her feel graceful despite her certainty of her own inadequacy. The world narrowed to the circle of his arms and the music and the scent of night-blooming flowers, and she was intensely aware of every point where their bodies nearly touched, the whisper of fabric against fabric as they turned, the warmth radiating from him that made her skin tingle with sensation she had no name for. "Your hand is trembling," he said softly as they swept past the fountain, in a turn that made her simple skirts bell slightly around her ankles. "Are you cold, or do you feel it too? this strange magic that has overtaken the evening. Clara found she could not lie to him in this moment of moonlight and music. "I feel it," she whispered, and the admission cost her something she had not known she possessed. The music faded as the final strains of the waltz dissolved into the night air, but Clara found herself still held in the circle of his arms, still moving slightly as though the melody continued in some private space only the two of them could hear, and she became suddenly aware of how close they stood, how the warmth of his body seemed to surround her, despite the cool spring breeze that stirred the jasmine vines and carried with it the distant sound of laughter from the ballroom that seemed now to belong to another world entirely. He had stopped moving, but his hand remained at her waist, and she could feel the pressure of his fingers through the thin fabric of her gown as though there were no barrier between his touch and her skin. And when she dared to lift her eyes from the vicinity of his shoulder, she found him looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch and her heart hammer against her ribs with such violence she was certain he must feel it. The moonlight caught the planes of his face and turned them into something both beautiful and strange, and she saw his eyes searching hers as though looking for the answer to some question he had not yet spoken aloud, and then he was leaning closer, and time itself seemed to slow and stretch like honey in sunlight, as the space between them diminished to nothing, and his lips touched hers with a gentleness that was almost reverent. Clara felt the world tilt and reform around the singular point of contact, where his mouth pressed against hers, warm and firm, and impossibly tender, and something inside her that had been locked away for so long, it had become part of her very architecture, suddenly burst open and flooded through her with an intensity that was both glorious and terrifying. She had read of kisses in the novels she consumed in the privacy of her small room, had imagined in her most secret moments what it might feel like to be held and desired and chosen, but nothing in her imagination had prepared her for the reality of this moment, for the way her body seemed to awaken to sensations she had no name for, the heat that bloomed in her chest and spread through her limbs like ophum through dry timber, the way her hands moved of their own accord to rest against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart beneath her palms. He deepened the kiss slightly, and she responded without thought or plan, her lips parting beneath his as though they had known all along what to do. Even as her mind spun with wonder and disbelief, and for a handful of heartbeats that might have been seconds or hours, Clara existed purely in the moment, in the sensation and the connection and the impossible magic of being wanted by this man whose name she did not even know. Then reality crashed back with the force of a physical blow, cold and merciless as winter rain, and she remembered with sudden, vivid clarity exactly who and what she was. A spinster of 28, with no beauty and no prospects, dancing in a garden with a man who was certainly a gentleman of rank and consequence, a man who in the morning light would see her plainness and her age and wonder what madness had possessed him in the moonlit darkness of Lady Pembroke's garden. Clara wrenched herself backward with a violence born of pure panic, breaking the circle of his arms with such force that she stumbled slightly on the uneven flagstones of the terrace, and the sudden cold that rushed into the space where his warmth had been felt like a physical blow that drove the breath from her lungs and returned her with brutal swiftness to the reality she had so foolishly allowed herself to forget. She saw confusion flash across his features in the moonlight as his hands reached instinctively to steady her, and she heard him speak her name, or rather the question of her name, as he stepped toward her with concern etched in every line of his posture. And the kindness in his voice was somehow worse than cruelty would have been, because it spoke of his continued enchantment with the illusion she had allowed him to believe, the fantasy woman who existed only in moonlight and shadow, and who would vanish like morning mist when dawn revealed the plain truth of Clara Ashworth. "Please," he said, his voice urgent now as she continued to back away from him toward the rectangle of golden light that spilled from the ballroom windows onto the garden path. "Tell me your name. Let me call on you tomorrow. I must see you again." But Clara could already imagine that tomorrow, with painful clarity, could see herself in the harsh light of day with her ordinary features, and her aging spinster's face, and her modest gown that would look shabby next to the finery of whatever grand estate this gentleman surely inhabited. And she knew with the certainty of long experience that whatever he thought he felt in this moment of moonlight and music would die a swift death, when reality intruded and he understood exactly how far beneath him she truly stood. She shook her head wordlessly and turned to flee, gathering her skirts in trembling hands as she ran toward the safety of the crowded ballroom, where she might lose herself among the masked dancers and slip away to her mother's borrowed carriage before this impossible evening could do any more damage to her foolish heart. "Wait!" he called after her, his voice carrying across the garden with an authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. But Clara did not stop, could not stop, driven by a terror that was all the more powerful because it warred with her desperate desire to turn back and return to his arms and let herself believe for just a little longer in the impossible possibility that had opened before her in the garden darkness. She felt rather than saw him move to follow her, heard his footsteps quick on the stone behind her, and she pushed herself to run faster, despite the awkwardness of her skirts and the slippers that had been made for dancing rather than fleeing. And it was only when she reached the edge of the terrace, where 3 shallow steps led down to the gravel path, that her left glove, already loosened by the dancing and made damp by the evening air, caught on the rough iron finial of the balustrade and pulled free of her hand as she rushed past. She felt the tug and the release, but she did not pause, did not look back, simply continued her headlong flight toward the lighted windows and the anonymous safety of the crowd, leaving behind in the spring garden the delicate evening glove that hung like a pale ghost from the iron post, and the man who stood motionless now, watching her disappear into the golden brilliance of the ballroom with an expression of mingled confusion and determination and wonder on his face that she would have given much to see. Clara arrived home as the first grey light of dawn began to soften the darkness over the Ashworth estate, slipping through the side entrance with the stealth of a thief while her mother still slept, and she climbed the narrow stairs to her small room with legs that trembled from more than physical exertion, and a heart that continued to race with a rhythm that had nothing to do with her hurried flight, and everything to do with the memory that played over and over in her mind like a melody she could not silence. She removed the blue gown with shaking fingers and laid it across the chair by her window, and even in the dim light she could see the place where her left glove was missing, the empty space where it should have been tucked into her reticule, a reminder of all she had left behind in that moonlit garden, and she sank onto the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her hands to her face as the full weight of the evening crashed over her in waves of emotion she could not name or order or control. She had been kissed, truly kissed, held in a man's arms, and desired and chosen, even if only for a handful of minutes that already felt more like dream than memory, and the wonder of it warred with a shame so acute it made her stomach clench and her throat tighten with unshed tears, because she knew with absolute certainty that she had deceived him, had allowed him to believe she was someone worth pursuing, when morning light would reveal her to be nothing more than Clara Ashworth, spinster of 28, with a plain face and modest circumstances, and no reasonable expectation of ever experiencing such a moment again. She touched her fingers to her lips and felt again the pressure of his mouth on hers, the warmth and the tenderness and the passion that had awakened something in her she had thought long dead, or perhaps never born at all. And she wondered with an ache that felt physical, who he was, and whether he was even now regretting his impulsive kiss, or whether he had already forgotten the anonymous woman in the garden and returned to the ballroom to seek more suitable company among the young and beautiful and eligible ladies who would have surrounded him the moment he reappeared. When her mother knocked softly at her door some hours later, the sun fully risen and the household stirring to life, Clara forced herself to rise and dress and descend to the morning room where Mrs. Ashworth waited with obvious curiosity and gentle concern. And when her mother asked how the ball had been, Clara heard herself say that it had been pleasant enough, but that she had developed a headache and come home early, the lie sliding from her lips with surprising ease, even as guilt twisted in her chest at deceiving the one person who loved her without reservation or condition. She saw the disappointment in her mother's eyes, the hope that had briefly flickered there dimming as she accepted her daughter's account of an unremarkable evening, and Clara poured tea with steady hands and spoke of inconsequential things, while inside her heart continued its painful work of letting go of something she had held for only moments, but which had somehow become precious beyond all reasonable measure. Lord Edmund Sinclair woke in his chambers at Sinclair House on the morning after the masked ball, with the spring sunlight streaming through the tall windows and the sounds of London stirring to life beyond his walls, and he found himself possessed by a restlessness that had nothing to do with the lingering effects of wine or late hours, and everything to do with the woman whose name he did not know, but whose voice and warmth and intelligent eyes he could not banish from his mind, no matter how he tried to dismiss the encounter as a momentary enchantment born of moonlight and music. He had returned from the continent only 3 months prior, after 7 years of war that had left him decorated and wealthy and titled and profoundly weary of a world that seemed to value nothing beyond rank and appearance and strategic advantage, and he had attended Lady Pembroke's ball with the dutiful intention of beginning the process society expected of him, the search for a suitable wife who would grace his table and bear his airs and ornament his position. But he had found the glittering assembly as hollow as every other social gathering he had endured since his return, until he had escaped to the garden and discovered her standing alone in the moonlight, like an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. He rose and dressed with the assistance of his valet, and took his breakfast in solitary contemplation, while turning over in his mind every word they had spoken and every moment of that impossible dance, and the kiss that had shaken something loose in his chest that he had thought the war had killed, or at least buried beyond all hope of resurrection. And when his hand brushed against the pocket of the coat he had worn the previous evening, he felt the delicate weight of the glove she had left behind, and drew it out to examine in the clear morning light, with something very near to wonder. The glove was made of fine cream silk, with tiny pearl buttons at the wrist. Well made, but not extravagant. The glove of a gentlewoman, but perhaps not one of great fortune. And inside, along the narrow hem, he could just make out the faint trace of embroidered initials, too worn to decipher clearly. And he closed his fingers around the delicate fabric, and knew with absolute certainty that he would not rest until he found the woman who had worn it, and learned why she had fled from him with such desperate haste, when everything in that garden had felt so perfectly and unexpectedly right. He summoned his carriage and returned to Pembroke House, where he found Lady Pembroke still abed, but willing to receive him when he sent up word that his business was urgent, and in her morning room overlooking the gardens where he had stood only hours before, he asked for her guest list from the previous evening, and saw her eyebrows rise with curiosity and amusement as she ordered it brought to him, and asked with barely concealed delight if the decorated war hero had finally found himself touched by Cupid's arrow at her ball. The list, when it came, contained more than 200 names, families of quality from London and the surrounding counties, daughters and sons and widows and widowers, all jumbled together without indication of age or appearance, or any detail that might help him identify one anonymous woman who had touched his soul in a moonlit garden. And Edmund felt his heart sink, even as his determination hardened into something very like the resolve that had carried him through years of campaign and battle and impossible odds. He would find her, he decided, as he folded the list carefully and tucked it along with the glove into his inner pocket, even if he had to visit every estate and knock on every door and present the glove to every woman of appropriate age in the whole of England, because he had not survived years of war only to lose the first genuine hope he had felt since before he ever put on a uniform, and rode away from everything he had known toward a future that had nearly destroyed him. Edmund began his search on a bright morning, 3 days after the ball, starting with the estates closest to London and working outward in systematic circles that would eventually encompass the whole of the surrounding counties, and at each grand house and modest manor he presented his card and requested a brief audience with the lady or ladies of the household, producing the delicate cream silk glove with a gravity that made some titter behind their fans, and others lean forward with barely concealed hunger at the romantic notion of being the mysterious woman a wealthy viscount sought with such devoted determination. At Harrington Hall he met 3 sisters who each tried the glove with varying degrees of success, but the eldest had a laugh like breaking glass, and the youngest spoke only of fashion, and Edmund knew within moments that none possessed the warm intelligence and genuine spirit of the woman who had stood with him under the stars and spoken of books and ideas as though such things mattered more than jewels or gowns or social triumph. At Westbrook Manor, the widowed Lady Westbrook pushed forward her daughter Harriet, a beauty of 19 with golden curls and porcelain skin, who fit the glove perfectly and smiled at him with practiced allure. But when Edmund asked if she had enjoyed the moonlit garden at Lady Pembroke's ball, she looked confused and said she had not left the ballroom all evening, and he moved on despite her mother's protestations. The gossip spread before him like ripples on a pond, and at each subsequent estate the ladies were waiting with rehearsed answers and studied grace, some claiming to remember a garden encounter even when their voices were all wrong and their eyes held calculation rather than the startled wonder he remembered seeing in the moonlight, and Edmund felt frustration building in his chest, even as his determination hardened into something unshakable, because he knew with absolute certainty that he would recognize her when he found her, would know her voice and her manner and the particular quality of presence that had called to something deep in his war-weary soul. By the end of the first week, he had visited 15 estates and met perhaps 90 eligible women of varying ages and circumstances, and society had begun to whisper that Lord Sinclair had gone somewhat mad with his romantic quest, that the war had touched his mind and left him chasing fantasies like some character from a novel. But Edmund paid no attention to the whispers because he had survived far worse than social ridicule, and because every night when he returned to his chambers he took out the glove and held it in his hands and remembered the kiss that had awakened him to the possibility that life might hold something beyond duty and obligation and the endless performance society demanded. The list in his pocket grew shorter as each estate was visited and dismissed, the names crossed through with methodical precision, and Edmund moved steadily outward from London into the quieter counties where smaller estates housed families of gentler means and more modest pretensions, and still he searched with patience, born of years spent waiting for the right moment to advance or retreat on battlefields where one wrong move meant death, and where he had learned that some prizes were worth any cost and any weight and any risk required to claim them. The gossip reached Clara Ashworth on a grey afternoon, 10 days after the masked ball, when her childhood friend George Whitmore called at the modest estate with news from London and the surrounding counties, and as they took tea in the small drawing-room with its faded curtains and well-worn furniture, he leaned forward with barely suppressed excitement and told her that all of society was abuzz with the most extraordinary romantic tale of Lord Edmund Sinclair, the decorated war hero and wealthy viscount who had returned from the continent only months before and who was now engaged in a quest that had captured the imagination of every drawing-room and assembly from London to the furthest reaches of the home counties. Clara's hand trembled as she set down her teacup and asked with carefully measured calm what sort of quest could possibly inspire such interest, and George explained with evident relish that Lord Sinclair was searching for a mysterious woman he had met at Lady Pembroke's masked ball, a woman whose name he did not know, but whom he sought with devoted determination, visiting every estate and presenting a delicate cream silk glove to every eligible lady in hopes of finding the one who had captured his heart in a single evening. The words seemed to echo in Clara's ears, as though coming from a great distance, and she felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her like a wave of ice-cold water, because she knew with absolute certainty that the man from the garden, the stranger who had waltzed with her under the stars and kissed her with such unexpected tenderness, was not some minor gentleman or younger son, as she had desperately hoped, but a viscount of wealth and position so far above her modest circumstances that the very notion of connection between them was absurd beyond all measure. George continued speaking, describing how Lord Sinclair had already visited more than 20 estates and met countless young women without finding his mystery lady, and how the romantic nature of his search had inspired both admiration and speculation, with some declaring it the most devoted courtship they had ever witnessed, while others whispered that the war had touched his mind and left him chasing phantoms. But Clara barely heard the words, because her thoughts were spinning in chaotic circles of hope and despair and burning shame. He was searching for her, she realized with wonder that quickly curdled into anguish. But he could not possibly want plain spinster Clara Ashworth of 28 years, who brought nothing to a marriage but modest accomplishments, and a dowry so small it would not keep a viscount's household in candles for a month. And surely when he had replayed that garden encounter in the clear light of day, he must have reconsidered and decided he sought not the unremarkable woman she truly was, but some imagined ideal he had projected onto her in the moonlight and music and temporary enchantment of masked anonymity. Her mother entered the drawing-room then and caught the end of George's tale, and Mrs. Ashworth clasped her hands together with romantic delight and declared it the most beautiful story she had ever heard. And would it not be wonderful if Lord Sinclair's search led him eventually to their corner of the county? And Clara felt panic rising in her throat, because she could not bear for him to come here and see her as she truly was in this shabby house, with its modest grounds, and realize what a terrible mistake he had made in that moonlit garden. The following week brought news that made Clara's hands go cold as she stood in the morning room arranging the last of the spring lilacs in a chipped porcelain vase, because George called again with word that Lord Sinclair had completed his visits to the estates in the northern counties and was now turning his attention southward to the quieter rural properties where families of more modest means lived in genteel obscurity, and Clara's own small corner of England lay directly in his path, with perhaps only 4 or 5 estates remaining between his current location and the Ashworth property. She felt the room tilt slightly as understanding settled over her like a heavy cloak, and that night she lay awake in her narrow bed listening to the spring wind rattling the old window frames and trying to devise some plan to be absent when he arrived, perhaps visiting a distant cousin or pleading illness or simply hiding in the attic like a coward until his carriage rolled away again down the rutted drive. But morning brought her mother's excited chatter over breakfast about the romantic viscount and his devoted quest, and Mrs. Ashworth declared with unusual animation that she hoped he would indeed call at their estate, because it would be such an honor to meet a gentleman of such noble character, even if his mystery lady was surely some beautiful heiress from a grand house, and not anyone from their humble sphere. Clara pushed her eggs around her plate and said nothing, her stomach churning with equal parts dread and shameful hope. And 2 days later, George sent word that Lord Sinclair had been seen in the village just 5 miles distant visiting the Thornbury estate, and Clara knew with cold certainty that her time had run out. She woke on the morning of the 4th day to see from her bedroom window a fine black carriage making its way up the drive with a crest painted in gold on the door, and her heart began to hammer so violently she thought she might faint as she watched the elegant equipage draw to a halt before their modest entrance with its peeling paint and weathered stone steps. Her first instinct was to flee to her room and lock the door, and she actually turned from the window with that intention clear in her mind when her mother's voice called from below that they had a visitor of great importance and Clara must come down immediately to help receive him properly. Clara called back through her closed door that she had a terrible headache and could not possibly see anyone today. But her mother climbed the stairs with surprising speed and entered the bedroom with an expression Clara had rarely seen, a mixture of determination and something almost fierce that made her small frame seem suddenly taller. "Propriety demands we receive any caller who honors us with a visit," Mrs. Ashworth said with unusual firmness. "And you will come down and behave as a gentlewoman ought, regardless of headaches or nerves." And Clara found herself, with trembling hands, smoothing her simple morning dress of pale grey muslin and following her mother down the narrow staircase toward the drawing-room where Lord Edmund Sinclair waited to continue his methodical search for a woman who stood now just beyond the closed door, with her heart breaking and reforming with every racing beat. Clara entered the drawing-room with legs that felt as insubstantial as water, and found Lord Edmund Sinclair standing near the window with his back to the door, examining the modest view of their small garden with its overgrown rose bushes and cracked stone fountain. And when he turned at the sound of her entrance, she saw his face clearly for the first time in full daylight, and felt the shock of recognition travel through her entire body like lightning, because even though she had only seen him in moonlight and shadow, she knew with absolute certainty that this was the man who had waltzed with her under the stars and kissed her with such unexpected tenderness 2 weeks before. He was taller than she remembered, with broad shoulders that suggested military bearing, and a face that was handsome in a severe way with strong features, and eyes of startling blue that seemed to see far more than most men bothered to observe, and there was a thin scar along his left temple that spoke of violence survived, and a weariness around his eyes that hinted at things witnessed that could never be forgotten or fully laid to rest. Mrs. Ashworth performed the introductions with nervous formality, and Lord Sinclair bowed with perfect courtesy and expressed his gratitude for their willingness to receive him without prior appointment, and his voice was exactly as Clara remembered it from the garden, deep and warm, with an underlying gentleness that seemed at odds with his austere appearance. Clara curtsied and murmured the appropriate responses, while keeping her eyes lowered and her voice carefully neutral, praying that he would not recognize her because surely she looked completely different, in harsh morning light, wearing her plain grey dress, with her hair simply arranged and no mask to lend mystery or enchantment to her unremarkable features. Lord Sinclair accepted Mrs. Ashworth's offer of tea, and they arranged themselves in the shabby chairs with the careful politeness of strangers, and Clara's heart hammered so violently she was certain it must be visible through her bodice as she poured tea into chipped cups with hands that trembled, only slightly. He began with courteous small talk about the weather and the beauty of the countryside and the challenges of travel on roads damaged by spring rains, and Clara responded with mechanical propriety while her thoughts raced in frantic circles. And then, after perhaps 10 minutes of this careful dance, he set down his teacup and reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something wrapped in white silk. With grave ceremony he unwrapped the silk to reveal a delicate evening glove of cream-colored kid leather with tiny seed pearls sewn along the wrist, and Clara felt the blood drain from her face because she recognized it instantly as the mate to the glove that still lay hidden in her drawer upstairs, where she had placed it like a talisman of impossible dreams. Lord Sinclair held the glove carefully, as though it were something precious beyond measure, and asked with quiet formality if Miss Ashworth had attended Lady Pembroke's masked ball on the evening of the 15th of April, and Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper as she confirmed that, yes, she had been present at that event. Lord Sinclair leaned forward slightly with the glove resting across his palm, like something infinitely fragile, and asked with careful courtesy if Miss Ashworth would be so kind as to try the glove to see if it might belong to her, and Clara felt the entire room narrow to just that small space between them as she extended her hand with fingers that trembled visibly in the morning light streaming through the worn curtains. She took the glove from him, and their fingers brushed for just an instant, and she felt that same electric awareness that had coursed through her in the garden. And she knew in that moment that he must feel it too, because his sharp blue eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and his breath caught in a way that was barely audible but unmistakable to someone paying such desperate attention. Clara pulled the glove onto her right hand, and it slid over her fingers as though it had been made specifically for her measurements, settling against her skin with perfect, intimate familiarity. And she heard her mother's small gasp of surprise from across the room, while Lord Sinclair went very still, with an intensity of focus that made Clara feel as though she were the only person who existed in the entire world. "The glove fits you perfectly," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her finally raise her eyes to meet his directly, and what she saw there made her heart stutter because he was looking at her with hope and wonder and the beginning of recognition dawning across his austere features. He asked in that same careful tone how she had enjoyed the ball and whether she had spent the entire evening in the ballroom or perhaps taken some air in the gardens, and Clara's defenses began to crumble like a wall, slowly collapsing under steady pressure because she could not lie to those searching blue eyes that seemed to see straight through all her attempts at concealment. She replied with voice barely steady that, yes, she had walked briefly in the gardens because the ballroom had been rather warm and crowded, and she saw the flash of something triumphant cross his expression before he controlled it back to polite inquiry. Lord Sinclair asked what time she had been in the gardens, and whether she had been alone or with companions, and each question felt like a gentle hand pulling away the layers of protection she had wrapped around the memory of that perfect, impossible night. Clara felt her mother watching with confused curiosity, and knew that Mrs. Ashworth could sense something significant happening beneath the surface of this oddly intense conversation about gardens and gloves, and Clara's carefully maintained composure began to fracture as Lord Sinclair leaned forward with both hands gripping the arms of his chair and asked with quiet directness that demanded honest answer whether she had perhaps encountered anyone else during her walk in Lady Pembroke's gardens on the night of the masked ball. Clara's silence stretched between them like something tangible and alive, while Lord Sinclair waited with an intensity that made the shabby drawing-room feel suddenly too small. And she could feel her mother's confused attention shifting between them as Mrs. Ashworth tried to comprehend why a simple question about gardens should carry such weight and significance. The truth sat on Clara's tongue like something both precious and terrifying, and she knew with absolute certainty that once she spoke it aloud, everything would change irrevocably, and there would be no retreating back into the safe shadows of invisibility where she had hidden for so many years. She opened her mouth and then closed it again as tears suddenly blurred her vision, and she heard herself whisper, yes, so quietly it was barely audible. Yes, she had encountered someone in the garden, and the words seemed to release something that had been held tightly compressed inside her chest since the moment she had fled from his kiss 2 weeks before. Lord Sinclair rose from his chair in one swift movement and crossed the small space between them and knelt before her with complete disregard for propriety or his expensive trousers on their worn carpet, and he took both her hands in his with a grip that was gentle but unshakable, and said with voice rough with emotion that he had been searching for her since that night, visiting every estate within 50 miles, showing the glove to every young woman who had attended the ball, because he could not bear the thought of never finding the person who had spoken with such intelligence and warmth and genuine feeling in Lady Pembroke's moonlit garden. Clara stared at him through her tears with complete incomprehension, because surely he could not mean what his words seemed to suggest, and she heard herself say in broken voice that she was nobody, just a plain spinster of 28, with no fortune and no beauty and no reason for a viscount to seek her out. The words seemed to strike him like physical blows, and his hands tightened on hers, and he said with fierce intensity that contradicted his careful courtesy of moments before that she was not nobody. She was the woman who had made him feel truly alive for the first time since returning from a war that had nearly destroyed his faith in humanity. She was the person whose mind and heart and spirit had called to something in him that he had thought was dead. Mrs. Ashworth made a small sound of shocked understanding from across the room, but Clara barely heard it because she was drowning in the impossible reality of Edmund Sinclair kneeling before her, declaring that he had searched half of England to find her again. And the tears spilled over and ran down her cheeks as 28 years of resignation and invisible loneliness cracked open like an egg to release something fragile and new and terrifyingly hopeful. He reached up with one hand and wiped the tears from her face with his thumb, with such tenderness that it made her weep harder, and he said softly that she had haunted him every moment since she had run from him in the garden, and he had known with absolute certainty that he would recognize her when he found her, because no one else could possibly be the woman whose voice and thoughts and very essence had imprinted themselves on his heart in the space of a single extraordinary hour. Edmund remained kneeling before Clara with her hands clasped in his, and began to speak with quiet intensity about the 4 years he had spent on the continent as a cavalry officer, watching men die in muddy fields for causes that seemed increasingly meaningless as the war ground on season after season. He told her about the noise and chaos of battle and the terrible silence that followed when the guns finally stopped and you had to walk among the fallen and try to find who might still be saved, and how something inside him had gradually frozen over as a way to survive seeing such things day after day without going mad from the weight of it all. He spoke of returning to England 6 months ago, expecting to feel relief and joy at coming home, but instead finding himself hollow and disconnected, moving through London society like a ghost observing the living from some cold, distant place where nothing could touch him anymore. The social world that had seemed vibrant before the war now struck him as false and shallow. All those bright young women trained to simper and flatter and perform exactly as society demanded, without any genuine thought or feeling behind their practiced smiles. He had attended countless balls and dinners and felt nothing but weariness with the endless parade of artificial conversation and calculated matchmaking. And he had begun to believe that whatever capacity he once had for authentic human connection had died somewhere in the blood-soaked fields of Belgium, along with so many other things worth having. But then he had walked into Lady Pembroke's garden seeking escape from another suffocating ballroom, and heard a woman speaking with real intelligence and warmth about ideas that actually mattered. And for the first time since returning to England, he had felt something crack open in that frozen place inside his chest. Clara stared at him through tears that continued to fall silently down her face as he told her that their conversation in the garden had awakened him like someone shaking a sleeper from a nightmare. And when he had kissed her, and felt her respond with such honest, unguarded feeling, it had been like being reminded that beauty and genuine emotion still existed in a world he had come to see as irredeemably ugly and false. He said that he understood now why she had run from him, that she must have assumed he was merely toying with her or seeking brief amusement before returning to pursue some suitable society bride. But she had to understand that what happened between them in that garden was the first real thing he had experienced in years, and he would sooner cut off his own hand than let it slip away into nothing. Clara shook her head in helpless confusion and whispered that he did not understand, that she was 28 and plain and poor with nothing to offer a man of his rank and consequence. But Edmund released one of her hands only to cup her face with his palm and said with fierce conviction that she possessed everything that actually mattered because she was real and kind and intelligent and warm, and those were the only qualities he cared about finding in the woman he hoped to build a life with. Clara pulled her hands from Edmund's grasp and stood abruptly with her heart hammering so violently she felt dizzy, and she walked to the window overlooking their small garden because she could not bear the intensity of his gaze while her thoughts spun in chaotic circles of hope and terror. She heard herself speaking in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to control it, telling him that he did not understand what he was asking or what the consequences would be if he truly meant what he was saying, because society would be merciless in its judgment and mockery of a viscount who chose a woman like her when he could have anyone. The words tumbled out faster as panic built in her chest, and she listed all the ways in which she fell short of what he deserved. That she was 28 years old when most brides were barely 20, that she had no fortune to bring to a marriage, and indeed her father's debts meant she came with less than nothing, that she possessed neither beauty nor connections, nor any of the graces that society deemed essential in a Viscountess. She turned from the window to face him with tears streaming down her face, and said with something close to desperation that the young women of the ton would laugh at him behind their fans, and the matrons would whisper that Lord Sinclair had lost his wits in the war, and did he truly wish to become an object of ridicule and pity for choosing so poorly when he might have had his pick of the season's diamonds? Edmund had risen to his feet as well, and she watched his expression transform from tender patience to something much harder and angrier, though she sensed immediately that the anger was not directed at her, but at the society whose judgment she feared so deeply. He crossed to where she stood by the window, and took her shoulders in his hands with barely controlled intensity, and said in a voice rough with emotion that he cared nothing for the opinion of people whose values were so twisted and corrupt that they measured human worth by age and money, and an arrangement of features that had nothing to do with actual character. He told her that he had spent 4 years watching brave men die in agony, regardless of whether they were handsome or plain, high-born or common, and those experiences had taught him that the only things with any real value in this brief and fragile life were courage and kindness and intelligence, and the capacity for genuine feeling, all of which she possessed in abundance, while most of society's celebrated beauties had hearts as empty as their perfectly coiffed heads. Clara shook her head in stubborn resistance because she could not allow herself to believe him. Not yet, not when believing him meant opening herself to a hope so vast and terrifying that if it proved false, it would destroy something essential in her. She whispered that what he felt now might be gratitude or infatuation or the lingering enchantment of moonlight and masks, but that in the cold light of ordinary days he would see her clearly and realize his mistake, would notice all the ways she failed to measure up to the Viscountess he should have chosen. Edmund's hands tightened on her shoulders, and he said with absolute conviction that he was seeing her clearly now, and had been since the moment they spoke in the garden, that there had been no moonlight illusion, because what called to him was not her face, but her mind and heart and spirit, and those did not change with the quality of the light. Edmund held Clara's gaze for a long moment, in which the air between them seemed to thrum with possibility and terror in equal measure, and then he released her shoulders and stepped back slightly as though recognizing that she needed space to breathe and think without the overwhelming intensity of his physical nearness. He said in a voice that had gone calm and gentle again that he understood this was a great deal to accept all at once, and that he would not press her for any answer or commitment today, because she deserved time to consider what he was offering, and to be certain of her own feelings without the pressure of his presence overwhelming her better judgment. But he asked with quiet formality whether he might have permission to call upon her, to visit properly so that they might come to know each other better in the ordinary way of courtship, and he promised that if, at any point she decided his attentions were unwelcome, she had only to say so, and he would withdraw, though it would cost him dearly to do it. Clara stared at him through the tears still clinging to her lashes, and felt something shift inside her chest, some locked door beginning to crack open, despite all her fear and self-protection, and she heard herself whisper yes, in a voice barely audible, even in the quiet drawing-room. Edmund's face transformed with such open joy and relief that it made her breath catch, and he reached for her hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture that felt both courtly and deeply intimate, and he told her he would return tomorrow afternoon if that was acceptable to her and her mother. Clara nodded wordlessly because she did not trust her voice, and Edmund held her hand for 1 moment longer before releasing it and turning toward the door, and it was only then that Clara remembered with a jolt of panic that her mother was somewhere in the house and would need to be told something of what had just transpired. Edmund seemed to read her expression because he paused at the door and said with a slight smile that he would very much like to speak with Mrs. Ashworth before he departed. And Clara felt a fresh wave of unreality wash over her as she went to find her mother in the small parlour where she had been determinedly occupying herself with needlework while trying not to appear as though she were desperately curious about what was happening in the drawing-room. Mrs. Ashworth looked up with such anxiety and hope mingled in her dear, worn face that Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she managed to say that Lord Sinclair wished to speak with her before he left. Her mother rose immediately with hands that trembled slightly as she set aside her embroidery, and Clara led her back to the drawing-room where Edmund waited with perfect courtesy, and he asked Mrs. Ashworth for permission to pay his addresses to her daughter with such genuine respect and warmth that Clara watched her mother's eyes fill with tears of amazed happiness. Mrs. Ashworth gave her consent in a voice that shook with emotion, and Edmund thanked her with a bow before taking his leave with one final glance at Clara that held such promise and tenderness that she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The news that Lord Sinclair had discovered his mystery lady, and that she was none other than Clara Ashworth of the modest estate with no fortune and no connections, spread through the county with the speed of wildfire in dry summer grass, and within 2 days of Edmund's first visit to the Ashworth home, there was not a drawing-room within 20 miles where the shocking development was not being discussed with a mixture of disbelief and scandalized delight. Clara heard the whispers first when she accompanied her mother to the village shops 3 days after Edmund's visit, and she felt the weight of stares following her as she moved through the modest establishment where she had shopped unremarked for years. And when she passed a cluster of young ladies near the ribbon counter, she heard one of them say in a voice clearly intended to carry that it must have been quite a clever trick to arrange losing the glove so strategically at the ball. Clara felt heat flood her face, but kept her spine straight and continued her shopping with as much dignity as she could summon, though her hands trembled as she selected thread, and her mother's face had gone tight with suppressed anger at the cruelty they both pretended not to notice. The gossip grew more vicious as the days passed, and Edmund began his promised visits to the Ashworth estate, arriving each afternoon in his fine carriage that seemed absurdly grand on the narrow lane leading to their modest home, and Clara knew that every visit was being observed and reported and discussed with eager malice by those who could not understand or accept that a viscount might genuinely prefer substance to beauty and character to youth. Lady Pembroke herself called upon Mrs. Ashworth with thinly veiled curiosity and what seemed like genuine concern, asking in careful tones whether Clara understood the difference between a gentleman's passing fancy and serious courtship, and suggesting with uncomfortable delicacy that it might be wise not to allow hopes to rise too high, lest disappointment follow when Lord Sinclair came to his senses. But the cruelest gossip came from Harriet Montague, the acknowledged beauty of the season, who had set her sights on Edmund from the moment he returned from the continent, and who made no secret of her fury at being supplanted by someone she considered so far beneath notice. Harriet told anyone who would listen that Lord Sinclair was clearly suffering some lingering effect of his war service, that no man in his right mind would choose an aging spinster over a young woman in the bloom of her beauty, and that it was almost pitiable to watch Miss Ashworth grasping at attentions that would surely evaporate once the novelty of his eccentric quest wore thin. Clara heard these things through her mother, who heard them from their few loyal friends, and each report was like a small knife finding the vulnerable places in her still fragile hope. But there was one voice that cut through the chorus of malice with steady support. George Whitmore, her childhood friend who had always seen her clearly and valued her truly, called upon her the week after Edmund's visits began and told her with fierce conviction that she deserved every happiness and that anyone with eyes could see that Lord Sinclair's regard was genuine and deep. Edmund arrived at the Ashworth estate the following afternoon as promised, and then again the day after that, and the day after that, until his daily visits became as regular as the sunrise. And with each visit, Clara felt the gossip swirling around them fade slightly in importance, as the reality of his steady presence began to sink into her understanding and reshape what she believed possible. They walked together through the modest grounds of her home, following the paths through the small orchard where apple blossoms hung heavy and white against the spring sky, and Edmund spoke to her with the same unguarded honesty he had shown in the garden at Lady Pembroke's ball, as though the intimacy created that night had established a pattern of openness between them that daylight could not diminish. He told her more of his experiences in the war, not the glorious battles that society loved to discuss, but the harder truths of fear and loss, and the way violence had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. And Clara listened with a compassion that asked nothing of him except that he be truthful. And she found that she had things to tell him as well about the smaller griefs of her own life, the death of her father, and the slow constriction of possibilities as year followed year without change. Their conversations ranged across literature and music and philosophy with an ease that astonished Clara, who had grown so accustomed to keeping her thoughts to herself. And Edmund seemed to delight in her opinions and observations in a way that made her feel as though her mind itself was something he valued and desired. He brought her books from his library, volumes of poetry and essays that he thought she would enjoy, and when she returned them, they spent entire afternoons discussing what she had read, and Edmund told her that these conversations were what he had been hungry for through all the empty social engagements where no one spoke of anything that mattered. On the 7th day of his visits, Edmund suggested they walk to the small lake that lay at the far edge of the Ashworth property, a spot Clara loved but rarely mentioned to others. And when they reached it and stood together looking out over water that reflected the sky in shades of silver and blue, Edmund took her hand in his with a naturalness that made her heart stutter, and he told her that these hours with her had become the center around which the rest of his days arranged themselves. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the quiet declaration, and she allowed herself to lean slightly toward him, and Edmund drew her closer until they stood together in the kind of peaceful intimacy that felt like coming home. And when he bent his head and kissed her temple with great tenderness, Clara knew with sudden clarity that the magic of the garden had not been an illusion born of moonlight and masks, but rather the first true thing she had encountered in a life that had been full of compromise and resignation. The invitation to Lady Pembroke's spring assembly arrived 10 days after Edmund began his daily visits to the Ashworth estate, and Clara felt her stomach twist with dread when her mother brought the cream-colored card to her in the morning room, where she sat attempting to concentrate on her embroidery, though her thoughts kept drifting to Edmund's promised afternoon call. Mrs. Ashworth looked at her daughter with concern and gentle encouragement both, saying that they must attend because refusal would be remarked upon and suggest either shame or fear, and Clara knew her mother was right, even as everything in her wanted to decline the invitation and remain safely within the small world where Edmund came to her, and the gossip felt distant and manageable rather than immediate and sharp. But Edmund arrived that afternoon, and when Clara mentioned the invitation with careful casualness, he said immediately that he would be honored to escort both Miss Ashworth and her mother to the assembly, and the warmth in his voice and the steady certainty in his eyes made it impossible for Clara to refuse, though her anxiety only grew as the days passed and the evening of the assembly approached. She dressed with unusual care in her best gown of pale green silk that her mother had helped her refashion with new ribbons, and when Edmund's carriage arrived to collect them, Clara saw approval and something deeper in his expression that steadied her trembling hands and lifted her chin slightly higher. The assembly rooms were already crowded when they arrived, and Clara felt the moment their entrance was noticed, felt the ripple of awareness move through the gathered company like wind across water, and she heard the sudden hush in conversation, followed by the renewed buzz of whispered commentary that made her cheeks burn and her steps falter. Edmund's hand at her elbow was firm and reassuring as he guided her into the room with his mother on his other arm, and he made no attempt to hurry or slink toward the periphery, but instead walked directly through the center of the gathering as though daring anyone to question his choice or Clara's worth. They had barely secured refreshments when the cutting remarks began, delivered by society matrons who smiled with false sweetness while their eyes remained cold and assessing, commenting on how surprising it was to see dear Miss Ashworth attending such events now when she had been so retiring for so many years, and wondering aloud whether Lord Sinclair was quite recovered from his war service, because surely such an unexpected attachment suggested some lingering confusion of mind. Clara bore these barbs with quiet dignity, responding with brief courtesy and refusing to show the hurt that carved itself into her heart with each veiled insult. But when Harriet Montague approached with venom barely concealed beneath her beautiful face, Clara felt her courage waver. Harriet addressed Edmund directly as though Clara were invisible, touching his arm with possessive familiarity and saying in a voice like poisoned honey that everyone was so concerned for him that they all hoped he would not make a decision he might later regret when reason reasserted itself over whatever temporary impulse was guiding him now. Clara stood frozen and humiliated, waiting for Edmund's polite deflection or uncomfortable withdrawal, but instead he removed Harriet's hand from his arm with deliberate precision and said in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent room that Miss Ashworth possessed more genuine worth and intelligence than all the celebrated beauties of society combined, and that anyone who failed to recognize her exceptional qualities revealed only their own poverty of perception and judgment. The days following Edmund's public declaration at Lady Pembroke's assembly brought a change in Clara that began not in her appearance or circumstances, but in something deeper and more fundamental, a shift in the very way she inhabited her own skin and moved through the world that had so long dismissed her as inconsequential. She noticed it first in small moments, the way she no longer automatically lowered her eyes when entering a room or softened her voice to near inaudibility when offering an opinion. And though the gossip continued to swirl around her attachment to Lord Sinclair, she found that the cruel whispers had lost some essential power to wound her because Edmund's steady regard had taught her to see herself through different eyes. Mrs. Ashworth remarked upon the change one morning as they sat together in the drawing-room, saying with wondering tenderness that Clara seemed somehow taller though her height had not altered, and Clara understood what her mother meant because she did stand straighter now, no longer curving her shoulders inward in the unconscious attempt to make herself smaller and less noticeable that had become habit over years of social invisibility. When callers came to the Ashworth estate, drawn by curiosity about the unlikely match between the Viscount and the spinster, Clara received them with a composure that surprised even herself, answering their probing questions with quiet dignity and refusing to shrink from the scrutiny that once would have sent her fleeing to her room in humiliation. Edmund noticed the transformation with evident pride and something like relief, as though he had always known this strength existed within her, and was gratified to see it emerging into the light. And he told her during one of their afternoon walks that watching her claim her own worth was among the greatest privileges of his life. The change was visible to others as well, and Clara began to perceive a subtle shift in how she was regarded by those who had previously looked through her as though she were a piece of furniture, their dismissiveness giving way to a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps Lord Sinclair saw something they had missed. And while Clara took no particular satisfaction in their altered opinions, she recognized that their changing perceptions reflected her own internal revolution. She spoke more freely now in company, offering observations on books and music and current events without the old fear that her thoughts were unwelcome or foolish. And she discovered that when she refused to apologize for her existence, people responded with attention rather than contempt. George Whitmore remarked during a visit that his old friend had been hiding a formidable spirit beneath years of practiced invisibility. And Clara realized with startling clarity that this was true, that she had been protecting herself through smallness when what she needed was to claim the space she deserved in a world that measured worth by the wrong standards, and that Edmund's love had not created her value, but rather had helped her recognize what had always been present. Edmund sent word 3 days after the assembly that he would call for Clara at 7 o'clock that evening, and that she should dress for a special occasion. And though he would not reveal more, Clara felt her heart begin to race with anticipation, and something like certainty, because there was an intentionality in his message that spoke of plans carefully made and moments deliberately chosen. She selected her gown with unusual care, a dress of pale ivory silk that caught the lamplight and made her skin glow warm. And when Edmund arrived in his carriage looking elegantly formal in dark evening clothes with an expression of mingled nervousness and determination that she had never seen on his composed features before, she knew without question that this night would alter everything between them. He handed her into the carriage with courtly grace, and they drove through the spring twilight, while Clara's curiosity mounted, and Edmund remained mysteriously silent, except to smile at her questions, with a secretiveness that was both maddening and utterly endearing. And when the carriage finally stopped, Clara looked out to see with shock and wonder that they had arrived at Pembroke House, at the very estate where the masked ball had taken place those weeks ago that felt simultaneously like yesterday and another lifetime entirely. Edmund guided her not toward the main house, but around to the gardens, those same moonlit paths where they had first met in darkness and anonymity, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the deliberate symmetry of his choice, the way he was returning them to the place where their story had truly begun, though neither had known it at the time. The spring garden was even more beautiful than she remembered, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and early roses, and the moon hung full and luminous above them, casting silver light across the paths and terraces exactly as it had that transformative night. Edmund led her to the same terrace where they had waltzed beneath the stars, and there he stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his, and Clara could feel him trembling slightly with emotion, barely contained, and saw in his eyes such depth of feeling that her breath caught in her throat. He spoke then, his voice low and intense, telling her that from the moment she had fled this garden, leaving only a glove behind, he had known that his life had changed irrevocably, that finding her had become the only quest that mattered, and that every day since discovering her had only deepened his certainty that she was the woman he had been waiting for without knowing through all his years of war and weariness and cynical disappointment with society's shallow performances. Clara listened with tears streaming freely down her face, as Edmund told her that she had taught him what genuine connection meant, that her intelligence and warmth and quiet strength had awakened parts of his heart he had thought forever scarred closed, and that he could not imagine spending his remaining days with anyone but her beside him. Then Edmund lowered himself to one knee on the moonlit terrace and produced from his pocket a ring that caught the silver light, and he asked with formal tenderness if Clara Ashworth would consent to become his wife, and grant him the extraordinary privilege of loving her for all the years Providence might allow them. Clara could barely speak through her tears, but she managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." And Edmund rose and slipped the ring onto her finger before gathering her into his arms and kissing her with a passion and tenderness that eclipsed even their first kiss in this very garden. And as Clara surrendered to the certainty of his love and the miracle of being chosen and cherished, she felt the last remnants of the resigned spinster. She had been dissolved forever into the reality of the beloved woman she had become. The formal announcement of their betrothal appeared in the London papers 2 days after Edmund's proposal, and the news rippled through society with reactions as varied as the people who comprised it, some expressing genuine pleasure at the romantic conclusion to Lord Sinclair's eccentric quest, while others whispered that the Viscount had taken leave of his senses to bind himself to a woman so thoroughly unremarkable and past her prime. Clara steeled herself against the continued gossip, with the newfound strength Edmund's love had cultivated in her, and she found that the cruel whispers had lost much of their power to wound, because she carried the certainty of Edmund's regard like armor against society's small cruelties. The weeks that followed the announcement passed in a flurry of activity that left Clara simultaneously exhilarated and overwhelmed, as wedding preparations consumed her days with decisions about flowers and music and the 1,000 details that accompanied even a relatively modest ceremony, though Edmund insisted nothing about their union would be modest, because she deserved a celebration worthy of the joy he felt. Mrs. Ashworth threw herself into the preparations with tearful enthusiasm, her years of resigned worry about Clara's future transformed into wonder that her daughter would become a viscountess, and Clara found herself deeply moved by her mother's happiness, which seemed in some ways even greater than her own. The selection of her trousseau became an unexpected pleasure, as Edmund accompanied Clara to the modiste and insisted she choose whatever pleased her without regard to cost, his generosity extending not from condescension, but from genuine desire to see her adorned in ways that reflected her worth. And Clara discovered a tentative enjoyment in selecting beautiful things after years of making do with what was practical and affordable. The most significant moment of the engagement period came when Edmund brought Clara to Sinclair Hall, his family estate some 30 miles distant from her childhood home, and she first laid eyes on the grand house that would become her home after their marriage. The estate took her breath away with its elegant proportions and extensive grounds, the house itself a masterpiece of classical architecture set among parkland that rolled green and perfect toward distant woods, and Clara felt a moment of panic at the thought of herself as mistress of such magnificence when she had been raised in modest circumstances. Edmund must have sensed her sudden anxiety because he took her hand and led her through the house, speaking not of its grandeur, but of how empty it had felt to him since returning from war, how the beautiful rooms had seemed like a mausoleum until he had met her in that moonlit garden, and how her presence would transform these elegant spaces into something they had never been before, a true home filled with warmth and laughter and genuine affection. As they walked together through the portrait gallery and the library and the music room where a pianoforte waited silent for someone to bring it back to life, Clara felt her panic subside and a different emotion take its place, a sense of possibility and rightness that whispered she could indeed belong here because Edmund saw her as belonging here, and his vision was teaching her to see herself anew. The wedding day arrived on a morning in late spring when the world seemed dressed in celebration, the sky a flawless blue, and the air filled with the scent of apple blossoms and early roses that perfumed the breeze drifting through the open windows of the cottage where Clara prepared to become a bride. She stood before the glass in her chamber while her mother fastened the tiny buttons running down the back of her wedding gown, a dress of ivory silk with delicate lace at the throat and sleeves that had been selected with Edmund's enthusiastic approval, and Clara marveled at her own reflection, seeing not the plain spinster she had believed herself to be for so many resigned years, but a woman luminous with happiness and the transformative power of being truly loved. Mrs. Ashworth wept openly as she worked the buttons, her tears a mixture of joy and wonder that her daughter, who had seemed destined for lonely spinsterhood, would within the hour become a viscountess, and Clara turned to embrace her mother with fierce gratitude for all the years of patient love and gentle encouragement, even when hope had seemed a foolish indulgence. The drive to the village church passed in a dream, the familiar lanes made strange and magical by the extraordinary nature of the day. And when the carriage stopped before the ancient stone building, Clara saw that despite the modest scale of the ceremony, Edmund had insisted upon the church was festooned with spring flowers that turned the doorway into a bower of white and pink blooms. George Whitmore waited at the church entrance to escort Mrs. Ashworth to her seat, and he paused to smile at Clara with such genuine warmth that she felt tears threaten, grateful beyond measure for this loyal friend who had never wavered in his support through all the gossip and speculation that had attended her unlikely betrothal. Then the organ swelled, and Clara began her solitary walk down the aisle, having no father to give her away, but finding she did not mind, because this journey to Edmund felt like something she was choosing entirely for herself. And when she lifted her eyes to the altar and saw Edmund waiting there in elegant dark coat with his eyes fixed upon her with such marked love and wonder that he seemed to have forgotten entirely that they were not alone, Clara felt her heart expand with joy, so profound it was almost pain. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn promises. Edmund's voice steady and certain as he spoke his vows, while Clara's trembled with emotion, and when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, and Edmund lifted her veil to kiss her, as was tradition, Clara tasted salt and realized they were both crying, two people who had been resigned to loneliness and had found instead in each other a belonging neither had dared to dream possible. The kiss was tender and reverent and filled with promise, and when they turned to face the congregation as Lord and Lady Sinclair, Clara saw through her tears that even some of the society matrons who had whispered so cruelly were dabbing at their eyes, perhaps moved despite themselves by the obvious authenticity of the love that had brought this unlikely pair together on this perfect spring morning. The wedding breakfast was held at Sinclair Hall, and as Clara entered the grand dining room, transformed for celebration, with flowers cascading from every surface and sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the assembled guests, she experienced a moment of such profound wonder that she had to pause and steady herself against the reality that this magnificent house was now her home, and these people had gathered to honor her union with the man she loved beyond all reason. Edmund remained at her side throughout the celebration, his hand frequently finding hers beneath the table's edge, and his eyes seeking her face with such open adoration that Clara felt almost embarrassed by the public display of his devotion, though she also felt a fierce pride that he refused to hide or moderate his feelings to conform to society's preference for emotional restraint. The guests who filled the dining room represented a cross-section of society, some attending out of genuine goodwill, and others clearly present from curiosity or social obligation, and Clara found herself the object of scrutiny, both kind and critical, as the assembled company assessed the woman who had accomplished the seemingly impossible feat of capturing Lord Sinclair's heart. Lady Pembroke, in whose garden the entire extraordinary chain of events had begun, raised her glass in a toast that praised the romantic nature of the courtship, and declared herself delighted to have played even an inadvertent role in bringing together two people so clearly meant for one another, and Clara felt gratitude toward the older woman whose ball had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Even Harriet Montague was present, her beauty undiminished, but her expression tight with poorly concealed resentment, though she managed a stiff smile when offering congratulations that fooled no one in their obvious insincerity, and Clara found she could look upon her former rival with something approaching pity, because she understood now that beauty without genuine connection was a hollow advantage. George Whitmore's toast moved Clara to tears with its simple sincerity, as he spoke of knowing Clara since childhood, and never doubting that someday someone would be perceptive enough to recognize the remarkable woman he had always known her to be. And Edmund raised his own glass to George in acknowledgement of the loyalty that had supported Clara through the difficult weeks of gossip and speculation. As the celebration continued with music and laughter and the breaking of bread among people who had witnessed her transformation from overlooked spinster to beloved viscountess, Clara found a quiet moment to reflect on the impossible journey that had brought her to this day, and she understood that the change in her circumstances was less significant than the change within herself, the recognition that her worth had always existed independent of society's acknowledgement, and that Edmund's love had not created her value, but had instead helped her finally see what had been there all along. She caught her mother's eye across the room and saw reflected there such joy and wonder that Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude for all the years of patient love that had sustained her through loneliness and resignation, and she knew that this happiness she had found was made sweeter by the memory of the darkness that had preceded it, the long years of believing herself unworthy of the very love that now filled her days with light and purpose and belonging. Evening descended softly over Sinclair Hall as the last of the wedding guests departed in their carriages, the sound of wheels on gravel fading into the distance until only bird song and the whisper of wind through the gardens remained. And Clara stood in the grand entrance hall, feeling the profound shift from public celebration to private intimacy, as Edmund closed the heavy door and turned to face her with an expression that made her breath catch, because she saw in his eyes not just love, but desire, tempered with such tenderness that she felt simultaneously cherished and wanted in a way she had never imagined possible. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to grow accustomed to this new reality of being alone together as husband and wife, with all that such designation implied. And when he took her hand and raised it to his lips, she felt the tremor in his fingers and understood with wonder that he was nervous too. That despite his experience of war and society and all the hardships that had shaped him into the man he was, this moment held for him the same weight of significance and vulnerability that it held for her. They ascended the stairs together in a silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, and when they reached the door of the suite that had been prepared for them, Clara paused on the threshold, feeling the magnitude of crossing from maiden to wife, from solitary existence to union with this man who had searched all of England to find her, and who now looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in all creation. Edmund drew her inside and closed the door, and in the soft glow of candles that had been lit by servants who had discreetly withdrawn, he began the careful process of helping her from the wedding gown she had worn, his hands gentle on the tiny buttons as her mother's had been that morning, though the context was entirely transformed, and Clara felt her shyness begin to dissolve under the warmth of his patient attention and the way he whispered her name like a prayer between kisses placed on each new expanse of skin revealed. When at last they came together in the wide bed draped with silk hangings, Clara discovered that the passion she had glimpsed in their garden kiss was only the smallest intimation of the depth of feeling that existed between them, and she gave herself to him with complete trust, born of knowing that he valued her not for surface beauty or social advantage, but for the essential self he had recognized even in darkness. And Edmund received her gift of innocence with a reverence that moved her to tears, even as pleasure moved through her body in waves she had never imagined. The night passed in discovery and wonder, in whispered words of love and the learning of each other's bodies and hearts, and when dawn began to lighten the sky and Clara lay in Edmund's arms, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his skin against hers, she understood that she had been remade not by marriage itself, but by the experience of being truly known and wholly accepted and passionately desired by someone who saw her clearly. Morning found them tangled together in contentment, and as they began to plan the honeymoon journey that would take them away from society's scrutiny to explore the world together, Clara felt the future stretching before her, bright with possibility. Spring returned to England in 1816 with the same soft insistence it had shown the year before, and as Clara stood in the grand ballroom of Sinclair Hall, overseeing final preparations for the evening's entertainment, she experienced a moment of profound disorientation at the recognition that exactly 12 months had passed since the masked ball at Pembroke House, where her entire life had transformed in the space of a single kiss, and she found herself marveling at how thoroughly different she felt now from the resigned spinster who had entered that other ballroom, expecting nothing more than an evening of observation from the periphery before returning to her quiet existence of invisibility and acceptance. The woman she had become bore little external resemblance to that earlier self, beyond the basic features of face and form. For though Clara's appearance remained what society would term unremarkable, there was now a light in her eyes and a confidence in her bearing that transformed her countenance entirely, and she moved through the preparations for this ball with the assured grace of someone who had learned her own worth and no longer questioned her right to occupy space in the world or to speak her thoughts without apologizing for their existence. Edmund watched her from across the ballroom, where he stood discussing arrangements with the musicians, and even at this distance, Clara could feel the warmth of his regard like a physical touch, and when their eyes met across the expanse of polished floor, she saw reflected in his face such open love and pride that she felt her heart swell with gratitude for the extraordinary gift of being seen and valued by this man who had refused to accept society's dismissal of her and had instead searched all of England to find her again. The ball tonight was their first major entertainment as host and hostess, and guests would arrive within hours expecting the elegance and sophistication befitting a viscount's estate. But Clara had insisted on including certain elements that reflected her own values rather than merely conforming to society's expectations. And so, among the glittering members of the ton, there would also be neighbours of more modest circumstances and several young women whom Clara had noticed being overlooked at other gatherings, wallflowers and spinsters who reminded her poignantly of her former self, and to whom she was determined to show the kindness of genuine attention and inclusion. As evening approached, and Clara retired to dress for the occasion, with her lady's maid attending her, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror, and paused to truly look at herself, seeing not the plain features that had once caused her such resignation, but instead the face of a woman who was loved and valued, and who had learned through that love to recognize her own inherent worth, independent of any external validation. And she understood with sudden clarity that Edmund's devotion had not changed her, but had instead revealed what had always existed beneath the layers of society's dismissal and her own internalized doubt. The ball began as dusk settled over the estate, and Clara stood beside Edmund at the entrance to receive their guests, and she noted with quiet satisfaction that while some still looked at her with barely concealed bewilderment at her elevation from obscurity to viscountess, others now approached her with genuine respect and even warmth, and she greeted each arrival with gracious attention regardless of their rank or their past treatment of her, because she had learned that true dignity lay not in revenge or resentment, but in rising above the smallness that had once wounded her. The spring afternoon was warm and gentle as Clara walked through the gardens of Sinclair Hall with her infant son nestled against her shoulder, his tiny fingers curled around a fold of her shawl as she made her way to the secluded terrace where exactly 2 years earlier she had waltzed with a mysterious stranger and received a kiss that had changed the entire trajectory of her existence. And as she settled onto the stone bench where she and Edmund had sat in moonlit conversation, she felt the weight of profound gratitude for the extraordinary journey that had brought her from resigned spinsterhood to this moment of complete fulfillment, holding the child she had never imagined she would bear. In the study of their private chambers, Edmund kept the delicate evening glove in a glass case alongside his military medals, that torn scrap of silk and lace preserved as carefully as any treasured artifact, because it represented the tangible connection that had allowed him to find her again after she had fled in panic from the possibility of happiness. And sometimes Clara would stand before that case and marvel at how such a small thing had contained such enormous consequence, how the loss of a glove had become the finding of a life. She thought now about the woman she had been at 28, convinced her story was already written and her role permanently fixed as the overlooked daughter who would fade quietly into insignificance, and she wanted to reach back through time to tell that earlier self that worth was not determined by youth or beauty or society's arbitrary measures, but resided in the essential character that no amount of dismissal could diminish, and that love, when it came in whatever season of life it arrived, would see past all the superficial attributes that obsessed a shallow world, and recognize instead the qualities that truly mattered. Her son stirred against her shoulder and made the small, contented sounds of infant satisfaction, and Clara pressed a kiss to his downy head and whispered a promise that she would raise him to value people for their substance rather than their surface, to look beyond the obvious to discover the hidden depths that existed in those whom others overlooked, to understand that every person, regardless of age or appearance or circumstance, possessed inherent dignity worthy of respect and attention. Perhaps you are listening to this story and finding in it echoes of your own experience. Perhaps you too have felt invisible or dismissed or convinced that your moment has passed, and happiness belongs only to others, more favored by fortune or genetics or timing. And if so, then hear this truth that Clara learned through her own transformation. It is never too late for new beginnings, never too late for love to find you, never too late to discover that what you thought were limitations were only the narrow judgments of a world that mistakes packaging for content and confuses youth with value. Your story is not finished while breath remains in your body, and the qualities that make you genuinely worthy of love exist independent of any external validation or social approval. Somewhere there may be someone searching for exactly what you have to offer, someone who will recognize your worth when others have been blind to it, someone for whom your particular combination of experiences and character and perspective is precisely what their own heart has been seeking. Hold fast to hope, even in seasons of resignation. Cultivate the internal qualities that reflect your true self rather than performing for approval you may never receive, and trust that genuine connection, when it comes, will see you clearly and value you completely for exactly who you are.